Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Intellectual Property is a Silly Euphemism, an essay by Cory Doctorow from TheGuardian.com, posted by Fear the Creeper. And I guess I would agree with that. I think intellectual property, if it's not physical, it's inherently not your property. I do think you should be compensated for the work you put into something. But if you're putting something out there that can be viewed online, ultimately, people are can take that and edit it and change it however they want to. Ultimately, I would say property is very much a physical thing, and if something's not physical, then it's inherently not property, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, should New Mexico lawmakers get a salary? Voters will decide in November, from KOB.com, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and they added, they currently get per diem, but they are only in session 30 to 90 days a year. I am of two minds here. It should remain unpaid as per how it was originally supposed to be across all states, but that also opens them up to openly pushing certain agenda through during the legislative period. They should get paid, but in doing so, legislative sessions should be at least 90 days a year. They should work for the people, and their wage should be the median state worker salary, and they should only get a raise whenever every employee gets a raise. Seriously, they just gave state employees, including teachers, a 1% raise, while also allowing insurance costs to go up by 5%, and not to forget that inflation is currently sitting around 3%. And I personally would probably agree more with the former than the latter. I personally think, if you work as an elected representative, you should be considered volunteer work rather than paid work. Right now, when it comes to government, it's mostly just grifting a lot of the time, especially when it comes to elected politics and elected positions. But I think the libertarian position is, if the taxpayer wants their taxpayer dollars to voluntarily go to the salary of their state lawmakers, like they should be able to, but I don't think they should be forced to send their state the tax dollars there if they don't want to either. It's their choice where their tax dollars should go to. I think the libertarian position is, you could make the argument, well, if it's volunteer work, they'll just try and find other ways to grift, insider trading and all that. But ultimately, I think the libertarian position is that, ultimately, people are going to justify, there's going to be bad faith actors regardless of if they're paid or not. So I think the libertarian position is if people want to pay them through voluntary taxation, they should be able to, but they shouldn't be forced to do so if they don't want to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, Supreme Court rules the Postal Service can't be sued even when the mail is intentionally not delivered, from APnews.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And they added, in dissent, Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote that while the protection against lawsuits is broad, it does not extend to situations where the decision not to deliver mail was driven by malicious reasons. Justice Neil Gorsuch joined his free liberal colleagues in dissent. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is if you want to sue anyone for any reason, you should be able to. If you want to sue the Postal Service for any reason whatsoever, I think you should be able to. Ultimately, when it comes to the law, people are going to justify doing whatever they want to justify. People are going to sue each other for whatever reasons they want to sue each other. I think, we shouldn't be holding government exempt from being able to be sued by anyone for any reason whatsoever. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, the state temporarily shuts down bar over hate speech, from TheGuardian.com, posted by FastSuverenist739, and that's a cross post from the anarcho-capitalism subreddit, and they added, fascists are the biggest snowflakes. And it looks like the article says, police seized art posters depicting Trump, Putin, and Netanyahu in Nazi uniforms from Canberra Bar. So I guess it's in Canberra, Australia. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is if you want to have art depicting anyone in a Nazi uniform whatsoever, you should be able to. I don't care if it's Trump, I don't care if it's Putin, I don't care if it's Netanyahu, I don't care if it's a more woke coded person. Ultimately, I think you gotta support freedom of expression first and foremost. And if people don't like it, they're free to not look at it or not even patronize the place to begin with. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, new ACA plans could increase family deductibles to $31,000. In parentheses, apparently the most expensive healthcare in the world isn't expensive enough yet, from NYTimes.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't think you should be increasing the family deductibles. But, ultimately, I think the big problem with the ACA is why we shouldn't have the government healthcare in the first place. ACA is finding the worst parts of government healthcare with the worst parts of private health insurance and putting them both together into one monstrosity. I think, if people want the government to pay for their health care, I think they should be able to. If they want to spend their voluntary taxpayer dollars to help for on health care, I think they should be able to. And if they want to have the private sector doing something, they should be able to. But the ACA is very much trying to please everyone by pleasing no one, and that's very much how a lot of politics works. You try and please everyone, but by trying to please everyone, you're going to please no one. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Pentagon to Anthropic. If you won't let us use your AI for mass surveillance or autonomous weapons, expect punishment from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't think the government should be telling a private company what it can and can't do. If the government does want to use Anthropic for AI for whatever it wants to use it for, they can justify using it for whatever they want to use it for. But Anthropic shouldn't be entitled to provide it to them for free or no charge. And ultimately, if Anthropic doesn't want to provide the government anything, it shouldn't be forced to sell to the government if it doesn't want to. It's very much with the libertarian position is a private corporation shouldn't be forced to deal with the government if it doesn't want to. And I think that's true of all private corporations, even ones that I might personally not care for. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Donald Trump demands Netflix fire board member Susan Rice from Variety.com, posted by Maddie O'Clock. And they said, they added, I don't want to ever hear a single word about Twitter files and how inappropriate it was for Biden to ask not to publish illegal nude photos of his son ever again. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Trump. Ultimately, if anyone wants to say that someone should fire someone for any reason, I think they should be able to. Susan Rice I think she was involved in Democrat politics for quite a while, so I can guess why he wants her fired. I personally don't really care for saying the company should fire X. I think that's very much cancel culture, which I personally don't care for. Maybe I'll say they should fire the coach if my sports team ever loses, but that's probably one of the rare exceptions which I would say fire someone. But ultimately, if Donald Trump wants to use his freedom of speech to say that Netflix to fire but Susan Rice says from its board, I think he should be able to, but I don't think he should use the force of the state to do that. And then I like the whataboutism the OP has here. He says, "Oh, the Twitter files, the government shouldn't the Twitter files, if the government did want to use their freedom of speech to tell Twitter what they couldn't post, fine, but they shouldn't have been using the force of the state to do that. That goes against the First Amendment. So ultimately, I think if you want to say anything, you should be able to. But if you're in a position of government authority and want to use your authority to influence a private corporation to make a decision that it wouldn't do otherwise, I think that's very that's not libertarian. I'd say that's for Donald Trump if he did make Netflix fire Susan Rice, and I say that for the Twitter files if the Biden administration did push Twitter to censor content that it might have not censored otherwise. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have how many kids can this administration lock up? Posted by Baton13, and that's another shit-lib Tom the Dancing Bug comic that they always like to post. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for a lot of government when it comes to authoritarianism, especially when it's against children. But kids were in cages under Biden and Obama as well, and Reddit didn't care. Reddit only cares now because the out-group's in power. The second the in-group gets in power, the government actors are still going to be being authoritarian against children among other groups. But Reddit won't care anymore. Reddit will just sweep it under the rug. It's like kids are in cages. But kids are, when kids are in cages, when the president has a D next to its name, suddenly it's not relevant anymore. Next, we have Pentagon threatens to make Anthropic a pariah if it refuses to drop AI guardrails from CNN.com, hosted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, as I said, I don't think the Pentagon should be forcing a private company to do something that it doesn't want to do. But ultimately, they do have the force of the state on their side, and I personally think the libertarian position is government shouldn't be telling private companies what they can and can't do. But ultimately, the government, if they do want to justify using the force of the state for a private company, ultimately there's nothing you can do about it a lot of the time. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have days before the national debt hit $39 trillion. President Trump didn't mention it once during the longest State of the Union ever from Fortune.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that, and that's about cross from the Fluent Defiance subreddit. And I personally don't really care for that. But ultimately, the national people are only going to care about the national debt when the outgroup parties in power. Right now that the in-group parties in power in regards to the Republicans, Republicans are usually the ones who like to hammer the national debt, but now they don't care about it since their reigns in power. And it'll be the same with Reddit when the Democrats get back in power. And yeah, I personally think at this point, we might as well just default on it before it hits infinity money. But ultimately, I guess we'll just have to wait and see what happens in regards to that front. Ultimately, it's interesting. If any single person was $49 trillion in debt, they'd be in jail for life. But the government can do it, and it's completely fine. It's classic pirates and emperors. When the individual does something, it's a crime. But when the government does, that's just the law. Next, we have Kansas invalidates driver's license, birth certificates of over 1,000 transgender residents from Reuters.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, I replied to this another post on this on the Shit Politics Says subreddit, and I said, quotes, if you don't give transgender people everything they want 24/7, you're committing transgenocide and are literally worse than Hitler, unquote. It's tired and played out by this point. Personally, I think if Kansas wanted to issue a driver's license where people had their sex on it or their gender on it or whatever they want to have on it, that's fine. But the libertarian position is, ultimately driver's license and state issued ID shouldn't be anything in the first place. And even if ultimately all the information you have them is ultimately going to be subjective rather than objective. Ultimately, if they want to have a space for sex, a space for gender, or a space for whatever, I think they should be able to. But ultimately, not everyone's going to be happy with it. And yeah, personally, I think if transgender people want to have their gender on their driver's license in addition to their biological sex, I think they should be able to. If they just want to have their gender on, I guess they make the argument they should be able to. But the thing is, ultimately, not everyone's going to be happy with however the current driver's license is currently structured. So ultimately, people are going to have to rely on whatever the state provides for its driver's license. Maybe some people don't want their address on there and they're forced to put their address on there. I don't know. I think that's why we shouldn't be forcing driver's license on people to drive if they don't feel like they want them or need them. And that's my thoughts on that issue. As Darryl W. Perry famously said, what's next? License toasting your own damn toaster? And that was the 2016 Libertarian National Convention debates. And then next we have Hillary Clinton Hartzler at Epstein testimony after MAGA lawmaker took photo of closed-door deposition from dailymail.co.uk posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Epstein subreddit. And yeah, I personally think Hillary Clinton should have done her testimony, shouldn't have halted her testimony. But ultimately, she's as guilty as the rest of them, but she's not going to face any consequences, just like Trump and her husband. She was probably on Epstein Island multiple times as well. But no one cares about her. The only person that Reddit cares in regards to Epstein is Trump. Reddit doesn't have to care about any politics outside of Trump, I would say. Maybe sometimes they'll go Republicans bad or because they're racist, sexist, transphobic, or whatever labels they want to use. But right now I would say Reddit really doesn't care about politics outside of Trump at all. Other than having pretty much generic DNC/progressive positions, it's only Trump bad to them, and at this point, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Pentagon shoots down government drone in Texas accident, congressional aides say, from Reuters.com, posted by Nietzsche, and they added, I don't even have words for this one. And yeah, personally, I don't think the Pentagon should be shooting down anything over U.S. airspace, but ultimately it can shoot down whatever it wants to. It just goes to show you how big the government is when the Pentagon is shooting down another government drone, and they don't even know what government what agency is that from. Maybe it's from a state or a local government, or maybe it's from another branch of the federal government. Ultimately, it's just going to show you how the government's so big that they can shoot their own drones down from another branch, and they don't even know about it. And that's my thoughts there. Next we have Trump enrages Maha with order granting immunity to global glyphosate pesticide production from thenewlead.org, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I think, the federal government should be granting immunity to anyone for any reason. But ultimately, if they want to justify doing that, ultimately they have the power of the state on their side to do so. Next, we have political storm in Wyoming as far-right activists call heading checks to lawmakers from TheGuardian.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I don't think that's very good. But ultimately, a lot of a lot of government corruption is done under the table. But now I guess we've reached the point where they don't even have to feel the need to hide it anymore. And that's just to show you how little faith people have in their government anymore. They don't have to hide how corrupt they are, and they still won't face any consequences for it. And I think the libertarian position here is, at this point, I think it's just a tear down. Just tear it down. Start over at this point. Let people, if they want to have a government, have a voluntary collectivist government rather than a forced collectivism like we have currently. And if they want to form their own governments, or they should be able to. Ultimately, each person's gonna justify what they justify. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter what system of government in place is. I would say, so at this point, I definitely do think, it's just to tear down and replace states personally. But ultimately, I think the government, I think it can keep on chugging for as long as it can, and that's usually how government works. It's going to keep on going until it can't go anymore, and then I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens there. And that's my thoughts there. So I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.